Before an avoidant ever comes back, they run tests you don't even realize you're passing or failing. These tests aren't announced. There's no conversation, no warning, no closure. They happen quietly in the background while you're trying to heal, move on, or make sense of the silence. And here's the part most people never understand. If you fail even one of these tests, you don't get feedback. You don't get an explanation. You simply disappear from their emotional radar. One day you're someone they still think about, and the next you're someone they've mentally dismissed as unchanged. That's why so many people feel confused when an avoidant never comes back, because they don't realize they were being evaluated the entire time. The first thing to understand is that avoidants don't return based on love, longing, or emotional clarity. They return based on nervous system safety and control. Every test they run is designed to answer one question: do I still have power here without risking vulnerability? That's why their tests don't look like tests. They look like silence, distance, casual detachment, time passing. While you're waiting for communication, they're watching how you respond to the absence of it. Silence becomes a tool, not for healing, but for measurement. Are you chasing? Are you explaining? Are you collapsing emotionally, or are you stabilizing without them? These tests are especially common in dismissive avoidance with narcissistic defenses. They need to believe they are self-sufficient, unbothered, and emotionally untouchable. But the truth is, their sense of control is fragile. It depends on knowing they still matter to you, without having to show up fully themselves. So they observe, they collect emotional data from a distance. They notice whether you're still centered around them, whether your self-worth is still tied to their attention, whether your energy still leaks in their direction even when they're gone. What makes these tests so damaging is that they're one-sided. You're not given the rules, you're not told what's being assessed, and you're not allowed to defend yourself. Any emotional reaction, reaching out, explaining your pain, asking for clarity, is silently scored as a failure. Not because you did something wrong, but because it confirms to them that they can still withdraw and you'll still remain emotionally available. That availability feels comforting to their ego, but unsafe to their nervous system. So instead of coming back, they pull further away. And here's the paradox most people miss. Passing these tests doesn't guarantee they'll return. In many cases, passing all of them is exactly why they don't. Because when you no longer chase, no longer react, no longer revolve around their absence, you stop being a safe option. You become a mirror, and mirrors are dangerous to avoidants. They reflect growth, independence, and emotional regulation, the very things that expose their avoidance. So before an avoidant ever comes back, understand this clearly: they are always testing, not to reconnect on, but to see whether you're still small enough, still attached enough, still unfinished enough to fit into the version of you they left behind. Test 1, the silence test. The first test isn't about distance, it's about power. When a dismissive avoidant goes silent, most people assume it's about needing space, emotional overwhelm, or time to think. But silence in avoidant psychology, especially when narcissistic defenses are present, is rarely about peace. It's about control. Silence is the first and most revealing test they run, because it requires no effort from them and gives them maximum information about you. By disappearing, they aren't healing. They are observing. They are watching to see who breaks first, who reaches out, who collapses emotionally under the weight of uncertainty. Silence becomes a pressure chamber, and your reaction inside it tells them everything they think they need to know. Dismissive avoidants are deeply uncomfortable with emotional dependency, not just yours, but their own. They need to believe they are autonomous, unaffected, and self-contained. Silence allows them to reinforce this self-image while simultaneously measuring whether they still matter to you. If you reach out emotionally during this period, asking for clarity, expressing pain, explaining your feelings, they don't interpret it as vulnerability or love. They interpret it as proof that they still hold power, that their absence destabilizes you, that they can withdraw without consequence. In their nervous system, that registers as control regained. From a narcissist niche perspective, this silence functions almost identically to narcissistic supply withdrawal. It creates emotional deprivation, forcing you into a state of heightened focus on them. The more confused, anxious, or reactive you become, the more validated they feel in their importance. They're not consciously trying to hurt you, but they are unconsciously checking whether you still self-abandon in order to soothe their discomfort. Do you override your own needs to maintain connection? Do you minimize your pain to keep the door open? Do you chase someone who chose absence over communication? Every one of those behaviors signals to them that the old dynamic is still intact. What makes this test particularly cruel is that it's invisible. You don't know you're being tested. You think you're responding normally to sudden abandonment. But in their internal scoring system, emotional expression equals weakness, and weakness equals safety. If you're still emotionally available while they are emotionally absent, they feel protected from intimacy. But here's where the paradox begins. If you pass the silence test, meaning you don't chase, don't plead, don't collapse, they don't feel relief. They feel threatened. Your regulation exposes their avoidance. Your stability removes the illusion of dominance they rely on to feel secure. So whether you react or remain calm, silence always reveals something to them. If you react, they feel powerful but repelled. If you don't, they feel curious but unsafe. This is why silence rarely leads to healthy reconnection. It's not a bridge. It's a diagnostic tool. And the avoidant isn't asking, do I miss them? They're asking, do I still control the emotional field here? When the answer becomes unclear, they don't step forward. They retreat further. Test 2, the indifference check. Avoidants don't come back when they miss you. They come back when they think you've moved on. After silence, the avoidant begins the second test, one that's far more subtle and far more destabilizing. This is the indifference check. By this point, they're no longer focused on your words, because there are none. They're focused on your energy. They monitor you indirectly, often without realizing it themselves. Social media activity, mutual connections, changes in tone, timing, or visibility, all of it becomes data. They're not looking for happiness. They're looking for detachment, and detachment is the one thing that truly disrupts their internal balance. Dismissive avoidants don't experience longing the way securely attached people do. Missing someone doesn't automatically motivate reconnection. In fact, missing you often increases their anxiety because it threatens their identity as someone who doesn't need anyone. What pulls them back isn't affection, it's perceived loss of relevance. When they sense that you've emotionally shifted, that your attention has moved elsewhere, that you're no longer orienting your nervous system around them, something destabilizes inside them. Emotional neutrality triggers a loss of dominance they don't consciously recognize but deeply feel. From a narcissistic lens, this moment mirrors narcissistic injury. Your indifference doesn't just signal independence, it challenges their false independence identity. They believed they were the one who detached first. They believed they were the emotionally superior one. When you stop reacting, stop performing pain, stop signaling attachment, it flips the hierarchy. Suddenly they're no longer sure where they stand. And uncertainty is intolerable for someone who relies on emotional distance to feel safe. This is why your calm feels louder to them than your tears ever did. Tears confirmed attachment. Calm confirms self-possession, and self-possession removes them from the center of your emotional universe. That's when the internal conflict begins. Part of them wants to reassert relevance, a message, a breadcrumb, a subtle reappearance. Another part of them panics at the idea of real engagement. So they hover in limbo, watching, waiting, calculating whether they can come back without risking vulnerability. The indifference check is where many people unknowingly fail themselves. Not by caring, but by pretending not to. Forced indifference still leaks energy. It still communicates preoccupation. True indifference isn't performative. It's quiet. It's when your nervous system no longer reacts to their presence or absence, and that state is deeply unsettling to avoidants, because it suggests you've done the one thing they fear most. You've reorganized your sense of self without them. At this stage, if they come back, it's rarely with accountability or clarity. It's often casual, vague, or indirect, a low-risk probe to see whether the old access still exists. And if it does, the cycle resets. If it doesn't, they retreat again, often telling themselves they lost feelings, when in reality they lost control. These tests were never about love. They were about power, safety, and avoiding exposure. And once you understand that, the silence stops feeling personal and starts feeling revealing. Test 3. The boundary probe. Before they come back, they test how much access they still have. By the time an avoidant reaches the boundary probe, the silence has already done its work, and the indifference has unsettled them. This is the phase where they reappear. Not fully, not honestly, not with clarity, but just enough to see whether the door is still unlocked. The messages are casual, almost meaningless on the surface. Hey, just checking in. Hope you're doing well. A meme, a reaction, a vague reference to the past. None of it is accidental, and none of it is about reconnection. This is not emotional courage. It's boundary surveillance. Dismissive avoidance. Don't test boundaries by asking direct questions, because directness creates vulnerability. Instead, they test boundaries by offering crumbs and watching how quickly you lean forward. The content of the message doesn't matter nearly as much as your response to it. How fast do you reply? How warm are you? Do you open the emotional door wider than they did? Do you ask questions, seek clarity, or signal availability? Every response becomes information, and the faster you respond, the more clearly you answer. The only question they're asking, do I still have access without accountability? In the narcissist niche, this phase closely resembles soft hoovering. There is no apology, no acknowledgement of harm, no ownership of the distance or the disappearance. Instead, they attempt to re-enter your emotional space as if nothing happened, as if the rupture never existed. This allows them to regain comfort without risking exposure. They want reassurance, familiarity, and emotional regulation, but only on their terms. Vulnerability feels dangerous to them. Accountability feels like loss of control, so they hover at the edge, testing whether they can be welcomed back into your life without changing anything about themselves. What makes the boundary probe so deceptive is that it feels hopeful. After silence and distance, any contact can feel like relief. Many people interpret this moment as progress, a sign they're being missed, a sign reconciliation is possible. But psychologically, this is not a step forward, it's a diagnostic maneuver. They are not asking, can we reconnect? They are asking, can I still enter your space without consequence? If the answer is yes, the cycle continues. If the answer is unclear or no, they retreat again, often disappearing just as suddenly as they reappeared. This is why the retention line matters so deeply. If you respond too fast, you've already answered their question. Speed communicates availability. Emotional warmth communicates access. Over-explaining communicates insecurity. None of these make an avoidant feel safe. They make them feel powerful, and power without intimacy is the only form of connection they know how to tolerate. Passing this test doesn't mean ignoring them or playing games. It means responding from self-respect rather than reflect. It means allowing space, maintaining boundaries, and not over-functioning emotionally to compensate for their lack of presence. When you hold boundaries calmly during this phase, something interesting happens. They don't feel relieved. They feel exposed, because boundaries signal self-worth, and self-worth confronts them with the reality that access to you is no longer unconditional. That realization forces a choice they've been avoiding all along. Step forward honestly, or step back permanently. Most avoidants choose the latter, not because they don't care, but because intimacy costs them their defenses. And defenses, to them, feel like survival. Test 4. The replacement illusion test. Sometimes they mention someone else, not because they've moved on, but because they want to see if you still orbit them. The replacement illusion test is one of the most destabilizing and misunderstood tactics avoidants use before either returning or disappearing for good. At this stage, they may casually reference another person, a date, a friend, someone they're talking to. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's blatant, but it's rarely genuine. This isn't about moving on, it's about measurement. They are watching for one thing: your reaction. Dismissive avoidants struggle deeply with object constancy, the ability to feel secure in connection without constant reinforcement. When distance increases, their sense of relevance becomes shaky. Mentioning someone else serves two purposes at once. On the surface, it signals detachment. Underneath, it tests whether you're still emotionally invested. Do you become jealous? Do you compete? Do you withdraw? Do you suddenly show more interest? Any emotional spike reassures them that they still matter, that they still occupy a central place in your emotional world. From a narcissistic perspective, this is triangulation dressed up as indifference. By introducing a third party, real or implied, they protect themselves from vulnerability while feeding their ego. If you react emotionally, they feel validated. If you chase, they feel desired. If you grow anxious, they feel important. And all of this happens without them having to show genuine intimacy or commitment. The illusion of replacement isn't meant to replace you. It's meant to confirm their significance. What destabilizes them isn't jealousy, it's indifference. When you don't react, when you don't compete, don't collapse, don't seek reassurance, the illusion fails. Instead of feeling powerful, they feel irrelevant, and irrelevance is one of the deepest fears for someone whose self-worth is built on emotional distance and superiority. Your calm response disrupts the fantasy that they are the prize being fought over. It suggests that your self-worth is no longer organized around their attention, and this is why indifference here doesn't make them happy. It destabilizes them. It removes the emotional mirror they rely on to feel real. Without your reaction, the third-party mention falls flat. There's no drama to feed on, no validation to extract, and suddenly they are left alone with the uncomfortable truth. They are not as central to your emotional life as they believed. That realization often triggers one of two responses: a more overt attempt to regain attention, or a sudden withdrawal framed as losing interest. For many people, this test is the most painful because it strikes directly at abandonment wounds. It can feel like being replaced, discarded, or forgotten. But psychologically, it's rarely about the other person. It's about you. It's about whether you still orbit them emotionally, whether your sense of value still depends on being chosen by them. When it doesn't, the entire dynamic collapses. And this is where clarity emerges. Avoidants who rely on these tests are not looking for mutual connection. They are looking for regulation without responsibility. They want reassurance without exposure, attachment without intimacy, closeness without cost. When you stop providing those things unconsciously, they are forced to confront the limits of their strategy. Some retreat, some hover, a few attempt real connection. Briefly, but none can continue the old cycle once you are no longer playing your assigned role. By the time someone reaches this stage and holds their ground, the tests lose their power. Silence no longer controls you. Indifference no longer provokes you. Breadcrumbs no longer hook you. Illusions no longer destabilize you. And at that point, whether the avoidant comes back or not becomes irrelevant, because the version of you they were testing for no longer exists. Test 5. The self-worth mirror test. This is the final test and the one most people fail. The last test an avoidant runs is not about communication, reaction, or access. It's about identity. By the time someone reaches this stage, the avoidant is no longer measuring your emotions. They are measuring who you've become. The self-worth mirror test happens quietly, almost intuitively. They sense whether you've outgrown the version of yourself that once tolerated confusion, inconsistency, and emotional absence. And this test is the most threatening of all, because it cannot be manipulated. You can fake indifference. You can delay responses. You can even hold boundaries performatively. But you cannot fake self-worth. It shows up in your energy, your posture, your pace, and the way you no longer bend to accommodate someone else's discomfort. Dismissive avoidants are not primarily afraid of rejection. Rejection is familiar to them. It reinforces their belief that closeness leads to loss. What they fear far more is growth, especially growth that didn't require them. When you develop self-respect without their involvement, it dismantles the internal narrative they rely on to feel safe. I didn't lose them, they needed too much. I was independent, they were attached. Your evolution threatens this story. It suggests that the problem wasn't your neediness, it was their avoidance. And that realization feels like exposure. At this stage, they begin to sense a shift that can't be explained away. You no longer over-explain. You no longer tolerate ambiguity. You no longer wait in emotional limbo, hoping for clarity. You make decisions cleanly. You respond calmly or not at all. You don't posture for attention, and you don't shrink to be chosen. These changes register at a nervous system level for avoidance. They feel it as a loss of leverage. The dynamic that once allowed them to stay distant while remaining central is no longer functional. From a narcissist niche perspective, this is where the mirror becomes unbearable. Your healed self reflects their emotional avoidance back to them without accusation or confrontation. You don't need to name their patterns, your boundaries already have. You don't need to demand accountability, your standards imply it. And that reflection strips away the defenses they use to avoid intimacy. It exposes the emotional immaturity they've been hiding behind detachment, independence, and self-sufficiency. What they see in you highlights what they have refused to develop in themselves. This is why many avoidants disengage permanently at this stage. Not with anger, but with quiet rationalizations. They tell themselves you've changed, that you're cold, that you're no longer compatible, that they lost feelings, but what they really lost was access to the version of you who made emotional distance comfortable for them. The version who adapted, waited, explained, and hoped. Your self-worth disrupts their internal equilibrium because it removes the unconscious agreement that once kept the relationship intact. For those who do attempt to come back during this test, the approach is often noticeably different. There may be more urgency, more emotion, or more intensity, not because they've healed, but because the stakes feel higher. They sense that time has closed a window, but without deep self-work, even this return is fragile, because self-worth changes the rules of engagement. You no longer negotiate your needs, you no longer accept partial presence, and you no longer mistake attention for intimacy. Most people fail this test, not because they lack value, but because they abandon it in moments of longing. They shrink themselves to feel chosen again. They re-enter old patterns, hoping the outcome will change. But when you pass this test, something irreversible happens. You no longer seek validation from someone who couldn't meet you. You stop interpreting their return as proof of your worth. And paradoxically, that is often when avoidants feel the strongest pull. When you are no longer available to be diminished. They don't come back when you're available. They come back when you're unavailable to who you used to be. This line isn't about strategy. It's about transformation. The avoidant isn't responding to your absence. They're responding to your integration, and whether they return or not becomes secondary, because the real ending isn't their reappearance. It's your exit from a dynamic that required you to be less than you are. If an avoidant hasn't come back yet, it's not because you failed their tests. In fact, the truth is much more powerful and much more freeing. Their silence, their distance, their subtle probing. It wasn't about you being too much or too needy. It was about them needing to feel safe while staying emotionally unavailable. And when you stopped feeding the old dynamic, when you stopped reacting, when you stopped shrinking to fit into their world, you didn't fail them, you outgrew them. You passed the test they never admitted they were giving. And that's the moment they realize something terrifying. They no longer qualify for the version of you who has healed, who has boundaries, and who refuses to be treated as an option. So if they haven't returned, don't take it as rejection, take it as proof. Proof that you became the person they can't control, and that you no longer need their approval to feel whole.